So yes, we've been looking through Kings, our series on Kings in the Old Testament, and we're coming near the end. We've got possibly two more. We have definitely got one more next week, Jonathan, and then possibly one more after that as well. So this week I'll tell you another thing is today, that apparently in the Netherlands it's Mother's Day today. That's what I've just been told. So Vons, just let me know that. But yes, also this week we've been marking the anniversary of the 80th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, the end of the World War II in Europe. And there's been, that's me. There you go. It was interesting because I was listening to it on the radio. I caught something of it on the radio, and a historian was describing how on the 8th of May 1945 everything sort of changed as Germany announced its official surrender, and cities moved from blackout. Like overnight there was just celebrations on the street, whereas previously they'd been kind of everything was blacked out in towns and cities across Britain. Suddenly everyone was out partying and all those blinds were down, all those blackout blinds and all those restrictions were suddenly lost. And there's there is a huge distinction between what it means to live in a time of peace and what it means to live in a time of war. And I guess we know, if we follow the news, there are places in the world that are still in a place of real warfare at the moment. So I think of what's going on in Ukraine, and we might think of what's happening in somewhere like Sudan. But as Christians, we're also reminded that we also live in a time of warfare. A spiritual war is going on. And Jesus struck a decisive blow, and one of the most helpful illustrations that I've heard on this, and I've used myself, is the D-Day, which happened a year before VE Day, was a point in when the forces of the Allies came over into France, and it was a decisive blow to Germany, and from that point on it was an inevitable victory for the Allies. And so Jesus at the cross is like our D-Day as Christians. It's the point at which actually Jesus has won a victory over sin and over death. As a Christian, Jesus' death and resurrection is our spiritual D-Day. A fatal blow to evil, to Satan, has been dealt. But it wasn't, with D-Day, there was another year before we reached VE Day. And we wait for a time when Jesus returns as Christians. We wait for a day when what Jesus accomplished on the cross is fully realised. So we are waiting as Christians in a time of our spiritual VE Day. And all of us are in that battle. All of us are in it. Nobody is outside of that. And every human heart is a battleground. Will I hate? Will I envy? Will I lust? Or will I love? Will I be generous? Will I show mercy? Will I forgive? Every one of us is in the midst of that battle. And the Bible describes the spiritual battle before and after the cross. And when we look in a book like, as I say, it's two books, but it's actually one real book in 1 and 2 Kings, these events 800 or 900 years before the cross, before Jesus, it shows how that human heart of struggling against evil, and more often than not, what it shows is just how it's not able to do it, it's not able to win the battle. And we're placed, when we look at those books, we're placed in a time when what seems is that evil looks like it's going to prevail. And what we're holding on to there, as Jonathan mentioned last week, is the promises and the character of God, that he's going to be faithful to what he says will happen. And these books, 1 and 2 Kings, reveal a battle for hearts played out through kings and through kingdoms that often turn from God, and every evil act starts in the heart. And 1 and 2 Kings only sort of hints or suggests along the way how God's going to unfold this plan. It is a clash between God's goodness and evil. And it sort of at times looks, as you read through it, we've said it's quite a lot of death and decline. It looks like maybe evil's going to win out. But as I say, that isn't the end of the story. And the books are meant to be God's perspective on these things. That God hasn't abandoned them. It was written by people that were in exile, that were taken out of their land and were looking backwards. And it was helping them try and explain, why has this happened? What's gone on? And through it, what we see is little prophets, these people speaking God's truth, popping up through the book. Sometimes promising that God hasn't forgotten, that God is going to stay faithful to what he says. And sometimes warning them and saying, but if you carry on this way, bad stuff's going to happen. And as I say, one of the things, it's really, what you notice in Kings is it is all kings, and these prophets pop up. And then there's suddenly this point in the book, which is what we read today, where suddenly prophets take centre stage. And that's what we're going to look at. And it's a reminder that God is central in this story. And Elijah is the prophet that we're going to look at today. He's not a king, but he gets this starring role in the books of 1 and 2 Kings. And he's a prophet in the northern part of this now divided kingdom. So it's been divided into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And he's a prophet in the northern part. And he bursts onto the scene in 1 Kings 17. And he starts confronting the nation and the king of that nation, Ahab, which Jonathan is going to focus in on, I think, next week. But he starts, Ahab and his queen Jezebel, he says that you've led the people of Israel into worship of other gods, of these idols. And he promises, he says that because of this, because of what you've done, there's going to be a drought in the land. And there is a drought. And for 3 years, there's a drought, and God's judgment is falling on this wayward people. But God keeps Elijah going through it. And near the end of the drought, there's this massive showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, one of these gods. And there's this big showdown. And the fire, and Elijah calls down fire from heaven, and it's an amazing story. It's worth reading in 1 Kings 18, but it's proof of God's unmatched power. And Elijah takes the false prophets and they have them executed, and it looks like the people have kind of been impressed by this display of power. And then Elijah prays, and the drought comes to an end. And Elijah, I guess, is thinking now, will the people now finally turn back to God? And the answer is no, they don't, sadly. He comes off the battlefield, and the hearts of the people, nothing has changed. And that's where we're going to pick up the story today. So if you've got a Bible, let's look at 1 Kings 19. So it starts in verse 1. And Ahab told Jezebel, so this is the king and his queen, all that Elijah had done. Also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. And then Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, so let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose and he ran for his life. And he went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came and he sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die. And he said, it's enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I'm no better than my father's. Then as he lay down and slept under the broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And then he looked, and there by his head was a caked baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and he drank and he lay down again. And then the angel of the Lord came back to him a second time and touched him again and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and he ate and he drank. And then he went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave, and he spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So he said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars and killed the prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." And then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake was the fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a small, still voice. So it was, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went out and he stood in the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your idols. They've killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Also you shall anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place. It shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knee have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." So we have this story of Elijah, where basically, far from seeing the people turning back to God, the queen Jezebel is absolutely furious, and she sets about to kill Elijah. Elijah runs for his life, retreating about 100 miles south from where he is up in the north down to Beersheba, and he moves about 100 miles, and now he's in a safe zone, to be honest. At this point, Judah is out of the reach of Ahab and Jezebel's rule, but he's physically exhausted and he's completely discouraged. He's just had a showdown which has demonstrated God's power, but nothing's changed. No words, no amount of miracles, none of the warnings seem to have made any slightest bit of difference. And I wonder, perhaps maybe you can think of times in your own life when God's answered prayers for those that we've been praying for, yet still their hearts haven't turned back to God as we'd hoped. I've got a family member of mine who has just seen God's amazing provision in his life, time and again. But yet, he still hasn't come to Jesus. It's easy to imagine getting discouraged at this point and I think that's what we see from Elijah here. Perhaps you can think of these times when you've served God, but yet outwardly you've seen very little fruit of it. It's easy to think then, isn't it? What's the point? Elijah's done everything that's been asked of him and there's no fruit from it. Only that he's now on Israel's most wanted list. He's physically exhausted, he's isolated, he's alone. His mission to turn hearts back to God seems to have failed. And he says, "It's enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I'm no better than my father's." And there are just three things that I want to mention. God shows that he cares for Elijah here in this moment. Elijah is on God's mission. And God is always doing much more than we realise. Elijah will see that. Firstly, God shows that he cares for Elijah in this miraculous way of this provision of this angel that appears and provides for him. He takes time, he gives him food, he gives him rest. Elijah seems totally discouraged, and it's easy to see. You know, imagine all of us can recognise times in our own lives when we're tired and when we're hungry, and it is a breeding ground for being discouraged. God sees his practical needs and responds to him, preparing Elijah for what comes next. And I love the way that we see God caring for Elijah at this point. And it's striking in this book that we see that detail, because actually Kings is one of these books which actually zooms out quite a lot. So you don't get a lot of detail sometimes, you just get this kind of quick summary. But here, we zoom right in to the detail. And I think God wants to show us that he cares about Elijah. Elijah's a man on God's mission. And you can't read his life. If you read from the beginning of Elijah's life, he's a man with a lot of energy. And he does what God asks him to do. He says in this passage, I've been zealous for you, God. I've been all out, sold out for you. It's cost him and he feels spent. And he's at a low point where what he needs is God meeting his most basic needs, food and rest. And at this moment, I think it shows that God really cares for him. He's on God's mission, but central to this is that God cares and loves Elijah, his man. Right when he's exhausted, when he's discouraged, on the brink of giving up. God doesn't give up on us at our low points. He shows us that at that point he cares for us and loves us more than ever. In 1 Peter, it says, 1 Peter 5:7 says this, cast all your cares, your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Really knowing that God cares for us makes a difference. Knowing that you matter to him, whatever your worries, whatever your disappointments, your physical well-being, they're all important to God. Elijah's not some impersonal pawn in God's dealing with a nation that is rebellious. He's dearly loved and he's dearly cared for. Let's not miss, when we're busy for God, let's not miss that actually he wants to show that he cares for us. He wants to pay attention to our individual needs. And there's no better place to look and meditate on the cross. There's scriptures like Psalm 139 to just spend time meditating. God knows you, God cares for you. Secondly, Elijah is a man on God's mission. After this time of rest, Elijah continues on the journey. So he's in a place of safety now. He's in the southern part of this split kingdom. But he travels on another 200 miles south to this mountain where God has previously met with Moses hundreds of years before. And it's a journey that takes longer than it should, and I think we're to pay attention to details here. It takes 40 days and 40 nights. There's significance in these numbers because it's meant to make us think about Moses' time on the mountain himself. Horeb is also known as Mount Sinai, and it's where God makes his covenant with Moses. This agreement with them, with the people of God, through Moses, hundreds of years before. And it's here that Moses gets the 10 Commandments and the rest of the law. And it's here that is the point where they've come out and been rescued out of slavery in Egypt. And Moses spends 40 days and 40 nights up on the mountain. And Elijah also has an encounter with God up on this mountain, which again looks backwards and is very similar to the one of Moses. And it doesn't say in this text whether Elijah is directed to this point, but I think there are hints that he is, because the angel prepares his packed lunch for the journey. He says, you've got a journey to go. And like I said, I think at this point Elijah knows he's safe already. As I say, I think there's significance to this mountain encounter that he has and the place it is. And it's a reminder that God made his covenant here and Elijah is going back, because that's what concerns Elijah, is that the covenant that God made with his people is being broken. And Elijah is coming back to that place to stand before God and say, look, I've tried, but the people have turned away from your covenant, from your promise. And twice God asks Elijah the same question, and twice Elijah gives the same answer. What are you doing here, Elijah? And he says back in response, I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I am alone and left, and I seek to take my life. And they seek to take my life. And it's all about the covenant with Elijah at this point, made with Moses. Elijah's on the same mission that God's always been on, which is God having a people for himself, saved out of slavery, living in step with him. And when God asks the question, I don't think he's trying to find out some new information that God doesn't know. God knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows what's happened up to this point. When God asks the question, he's doing heart surgery on Elijah to get to know what is in his heart. And as I thought of that, I wonder what I would say if God asked me the question, what are you doing here, Steve? What are you doing here? What's led you to come this afternoon into this hall? What's led you to make the decisions that you make in your life? How zealous are you for the things that matter to God? What matters in your decision making and how you live? And I don't think in this, different people read this slightly different, but I don't think Elijah here is saying anything that's not genuinely true for him. I think that's what he's all about. What matters to Elijah is he does care about God's mission. He's concerned about the things that matter to God. And I think it's really important that when we read stuff, when it's repeated, it's really helpful to know that when things are repeated in the Bible in a bit of a passage, pay close attention to what's being said. But Elijah's discouragement is rooted in having done everything that God has asked of him. It doesn't seem like it's working. It doesn't seem like it's bearing any fruit. And I kind of was asking myself the same question, is when I get despairing and discouraged, is it because of the things that matter to God? Is it my agenda or is it God's agenda that gets my zeal, that gets my passion, that gets my energy and my heartache? And when God asked this question of Elijah twice, and on a second occasion, after all of the kind of the drama of all this earthquake and the fire or whatever, he asks him in this still, quiet voice. And up to this point, Elijah's been a man of action, a man of God's power, but here God just comes to him and whispers in a quiet voice. It's the same voice that spoke the universe into existence. It sort of blows my mind. It's that voice. But yet here it is in this most intimate of moments. And God meets him in this closeness. He's cared for him practically, and now he comes to him in this intimate, quiet, coming up close. The world's a very noisy place, and I think, in history, if we look at how many things are clamouring for our attention, and I wonder, are we creating time and space in our lives to listen and hear the voice of God? Making himself known to us, setting our agenda. When I get before him in prayer, am I going at it with a whole reeling off a list of things and demands and things that I need to happen? Or am I going saying, God, give me your voice, give me your voice? When I pick up my Bible, am I going and saying, God, teach me your ways? Activity on behalf of God is no substitute for the presence of God. And I think that's especially true when we're feeling discouraged. Finally then, the encounter with God ends with God giving Elijah this bigger perspective and this fresh set of orders. His eyes are lifted heavenward, and we see that there's more going on than he ever knew about was happening. Far from being alone, Elijah, as he says, I'm alone, I'm the only one. God says, no, there's 7,000 others. God has still been at work. Elijah's been in the trenches of this battlefield and he hasn't seen the bigger picture that God now reveals to him. And I don't think that's a criticism of Elijah. He's been doing what God has asked him to do, but it is a reminder that when we're about God's work, we can expect obstacles, we can expect opposition, and we need to be regularly before God and gain his perspective. Coming back to the promises and the character that Jonathan mentioned yesterday lifts our gaze. Knowing and listening to the stories that are happening around the world. I don't know if you follow or you get updates, but actually hearing what the church is going on in the church across the world, not just now but through history, is incredibly encouraging to gain that bigger perspective that God is at work and helps you when things are struggling. And more than a few times I've needed to just come back and keep coming back to the cross, because there is no place where what looks like defeat is actually spectacular victory as the cross. And coming into his presence, reminding myself of his promises, his faithfulness, and that the battle here belongs to God. Even as Elijah looks at his efforts, he looks and sees defeat, God's been working out his plan. When Jesus is crucified on the cross, as I say, it looks like truth, it looks like defeat, but it isn't. Jesus has taken sin's curse on himself. It was God's spiritual D-Day, when Satan, the author of evil, was delivered a fatal blow. And when we put our trust in Jesus, we change sides. We change loyalties in this battle. God gives us a renewed heart, one that hopes, trusts and wills to be obedient to him. God's response to Elijah is just what we need to hear. God's plan hasn't been derailed at all. And he doesn't retire Elijah at this point. He goes and said, he gives some new orders. Go anoint these 3 people, Hazael, Jehu and Elisha. And he returns into the heart of the battle, knowing that he's not on his own. So to finish and summarise, God's response to Elijah's discouragement is not condemnation, but it's gentle care and rest. It's quiet revelation of who he is, that still small voice. And Elijah's a faithful servant of God in the midst of a battle. We'll all get to those points where we wonder, is the battle lost? Is it going? Are we seeing the fruit that we hope for and long for? We're not immune to those moments. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, he's the writer of the Narnia books, and he says this: there's no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan. We live the other side of the cross to Elijah, seeing what he only sees far off. We live knowing that Jesus has won a victory over sin and death, and it's real. And that we live now in a time of mercy and not God's judgment. There's an eternal heir of King David on the throne. That promise that we've read through Kings. There's an eternal heir of King David on the throne, and he leads us. Satan's power is broken, sin's penalty is paid, and we are united with Jesus. Jesus is our D-Day. But we also live in this time of battle where it's not yet fully realised, where God's kingdom rule isn't fully realised. All of evil is not removed. The final judgment and the future hope is still there for us. We still have those battles with sin. And the world remains under the shadow of evil until Jesus returns. But it's a battle for every human heart. And we're called as the church to play our part in that, just like Elijah. We're not to be passive bystanders, but we're active in living out the gospel to transform lives and communities. And we're not immune to exhaustion and discouragement. We're still in the battle. It's not yet our spiritual VE day. And And as I say, I think this story tells us something about how it's played out in really practical ways. What we see here is Elijah just experiencing emotions of fear and discouragement, and his physical needs need tending to. He, like us, needs to coming back to God from every need. And I want to finish in a second with just reading Ephesians 6, which is a famous passage that Paul wrote to a church that was under the cosh, that was right under it, and just reminding them of this battle that they were in. And I want to just say that for people that are discouraged, there are two things, two D's I had. One is those that feel discouraged, those that feel weary, those that feel a bit disillusioned, or like, where is the fruit, God? I want to, as I read this out, I want you to just say, God, I want to see more of what you're doing in the world. I want to see more of that perspective on things, and I want to take me back to the cross and the victory on the cross. And then the other one was the word distracted, was the word I had, which was for those of us that feel like perhaps actually our lives have just got busy and noisy with everything else, and that actually we need God's agenda, that actually He's called us to be something as the church. He has called us to do something and be on mission with Him. And that where we've got distracted, to just come back and say, God, your will be done in my life. So as I'm going to read this, I just ask you to close your eyes, and I'm just going to read this to us. Almost as a prayer, really, I guess. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armour of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, and against the authorities, and against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you've done everything else, to stand. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all of this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions and with all kinds of prayers and requests. And with this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. Pray also for me, that whenever I speak, words may be given to me, so that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains. Pray that I may declare it fearlessly as I should. Yeah, Father, I just pray for that. I pray that we would be people that, one, recognise we live in a time of spiritual warfare, God, but in it, that we're not people that are gone unequipped, that we stand on the truth of your victory, your D-Day at the cross where you've won the victory. And I pray for each one of us as we go from here, God, not to be discouraged, not to be distracted, but to be people that are zealous for your purposes, and also people that come into your presence for all that we need, but knowing that you care for us, knowing that you have everything we need. God, let us go fully equipped into this battle, I pray in your precious name. Amen.